Right, I have had a bit of a traumatic week this week. Lost all my notes. The builders descended on our block of flats this week like a plague of locusts. And like a plague of locusts, they swept all before them, including my notes. So, and I thought, well, I might be able to make it up on Friday night. I'll go home and after the prayer meeting and sort of perhaps do an all-nighter. So I stuck the key in the door and it wouldn't open. They changed the locks. So I wasn't able to get in home. So hope you'll bear with me if I seem a little bit scatterbrained this morning. Noah is a story about faith. And boy, it's going to take some faith this morning. It's about obedience, and it's taken quite a bit of obedience to get up here this morning. Hebrews 11 talks about Noah as a man of faith. I think it's 11 verse 7 or something like that, Hebrews 11. He's one of the heroes of faith. And if I read some of my theological books, he's portrayed in a very dry way. He's portrayed as the last of the antediluvian prophets. What does that mean? It means the last of the prophets before the flood. But they can't say that, you have to use a big word. So he's the last of the ones before the flood. And Noah, we all know the story, or think we know the story. It's about God saying he's going to send a flood to wipe away a crooked and perverse generation. And we all think we know the story about the animals going in 2 by 2 and 40 days of rain, etc., etc. It's a little bit more complicated than that. It's one of those stories that the more you read it, the story of Noah actually stretches from chapter 5 of Genesis to chapter 9 of Genesis. So I think we'll start now. We should just about be finished by 5 to 11. 5 to 12. No, I'm not going to do that really. You, in your own home studies, can look at Genesis 5 to 11, and I guarantee the more you read the story, the more you'll be interested and engaged by it. It's a story about faith, it's a story about obedience, it's a story about destruction, it's a story about restoration. It's a story that we can apply to our lives individually and corporately today. Now, I know that there's all sorts of discussion about, in theological circles, was the story of Noah, is it redacted? What does that mean? It means, was it edited? Was it compiled by someone? Perhaps Ezra the scribe, some theologians will say. Well, that's great, you can study that. But I want to get to the essence of what the story is talking about this morning. So I'm not going to talk about whether Noah was a historical figure, whether the flood covered the whole earth. All I will say is that in Matthew 24, Jesus talks about Noah and accepts him as entirely historical, and the situation that he went through is entirely factual. What Jesus talks about when he's talking about Noah is the generation in which he lived, and the fact that Noah was the only one who was seen by God to be righteous. He was the only one seen by God to be acceptable. Now that doesn't mean he was perfect. We know that from later on. There's some interesting stories about Noah later on. He is the first one to introduce us to wine, for instance, and the consequences of too much wine. So some people will thank him for that and some people won't. But it doesn't mean that he was perfect. It means, and I think Genesis talks about the fact that Noah walked with God. There's only 2 men in the Bible, 2 people in the Bible that are spoken about as having walked with God. Enoch and Noah. And it all sounds very mystical. And I suppose there's an element of mystery and some of that aspect of walking with God, especially in Enoch. He walked with God and he was no more. What does that mean? Well, I guess it'll be revealed at some point. But what does it mean? It means he walked with God. Didn't walk ahead of him, didn't lag behind him. And it's like when you're walking with a companion on a walk around on the hills or on the coast or just going for a walk. You're having conversation with someone. If you're walking too fast, they can't hear you. And if you're walking far behind, they can't hear you either. There's no communication with each other. So Noah walked with God. And I believe that's something that we want to do, is to walk with God. And it's something that Jesus has enabled us to do, is to walk with God. So, what happens? Noah gets told 120 years before, and again people have sort of, what about all these years and so on. Actually, just before Noah gets told that in 120 years' time, although he didn't know it at the time, in 120 years' time there's going to be a flood. It's interesting that God says, "My spirit will not contend with man forever. His days shall be 120 years. It's almost like God is prophesying something, that in 120 years' time, man is mortal, and his days will be numbered to 120 years. Now later on in the Bible, we get told that a man's days are 70. But at that time, that's what God had decided. And God said he looked and was grieved and was pained that the creation that he'd made had turned into such a crooked and perverse and utterly evil generation. And the only one who stood out that God could see was Noah. And I think it's Philippians 2. In Philippians 2, Paul is talking to the Philippians and he's saying, "You shine like stars in a crooked and perverse generation." And Noah shone before God. He was seen to be righteous. And that faith that Noah had, that he believed in God, caused him to do something that got him noticed. He started to build an ark. And it was an ark that was commanded by God. The dimensions were given by God. The type of wood apparently was given by God. The place in which it was to be constructed was given by God. And Noah began to build an ark in the middle of a desert, probably some 500 miles from anywhere where there was a sea. And we're told in actual fact that there was no rain in those days. That the land was watered by streams and springs and fountains of the deep, I think is one of the descriptions. The land was watered in that way. There was no rain. I think you find that in Genesis 2. So Noah wouldn't even know what rain was, let alone a flood. But he's told to build an ark. Well, what's an ark in the middle of a desert? And it's a big boat, basically. He's told to build it very specifically. And for 120 years, he labored at building this ark. And you can imagine the ridicule and the scorn and the scoffing that was spoken against him. And sometimes I find in my life, I'm sure it echoes in other people's lives, you're a bit worried to stand out for your Christian faith in case you are mocked and you're scorned and you're derided. It's not easy sometimes following faith, being obedient to God. It's not easy. Sometimes it is, but sometimes it's not. And God spoke to Noah and said, "Build an ark." Now I don't know about you, but sometimes I wonder how he heard that voice of God. Was it a loud shout? Or was it a whisper? Noah, build an ark. Or was it the same kind of voice Jesus used when he called Lazarus from the tomb? "Lazarus, come forth!" Quiet or loud? Noah heard. Noah obeyed. Actually, it's interesting that the Lazarus one, he's told to come forth. Not come out, not get up, come forth. You can imagine that must have been quite difficult. 3 days in a tomb. I'm digressing a bit, but you'll see where I'm going. 3 days in a tomb, and he's called out, come forth. I wonder how he managed to get up. Because he'd be all tightly bound up and sort of coming out like so. Come forth. Come forth into what? The presence of Jesus. Come forth from the darkness into the light. Not come out or get out. That was something Jesus left for use when he was dealing with demons. Get out. No place for you. No, but for those he loves, it's come forth. Come to me. Come into my presence. Jesus says, come to me, you who labour, you who are burdened, and I will give you rest. Take on you my yoke, for it's easy. Now we often think that Jesus, when he's talking about a yoke there, he's talking about a yoke of oxen, and he may very well have been. But there's another sense in which Jesus talks about a yoke there. And that's the sense that in those days, young boys, young men, would begin to learn the Torah, the law, the prophets, the writings of the Old Testament. And if they became very adept at it, they might be taken to a rabbi. And different rabbis would minister in different ways. But if you went to a rabbi and began to learn under him, the rabbi's teaching was called the yoke. It was his teaching. It was his method of explaining the scriptures. And the disciple would take on the yoke. And Jesus is saying, you know, you see all these young men, and if you become the very best of the very best, you can take on the yoke of a rabbi and become the disciple of a particular rabbi. And it's difficult, it's very hard. Only the best of the best could do it. But Jesus says, take on my yoke, for my yoke is easy. My yoke is light. Why? Because it's about life. It's talking about you're in darkness and I'm the light. You're struggling under the law and I'm the fulfillment of the law. Now what's that got to do with Noah? I hear you asking. I told you I've got no notes. You're going on a little bit here. What is to do with Noah is that Noah took on the word of God. He was faithful and he was obedient. He built exactly to the dimensions that God commanded. 120 years later. And really, we don't hear that God had spoken to him since that one word, build an ark, I'm bringing a flood, I'm going to do something that's going to be destruction. 120 years of probably not a cloud in the sky, it's the desert, remember? And then God speaks again. 7 days from now, the rains will come. Gather the animals. And so Noah goes and does that. Now we all know the story. The animals came 2 by 2. Actually, it's 2 pairs of each animal if you read it. And if you read in Genesis 7, the clean animals, there are 7 pairs. And of the non-clean animals, there are 2 pairs. And of the birds, there are 7 pairs of each of its own kind. And interestingly, at a little aside, and take on board all the food and the seeds. Now isn't it interesting that Kew Gardens in London have been over the last 40 or 50 years collecting seeds from every rare plant in the world. And some people have called it a new Noah's Ark. They're saving those seeds because, just like in the days of Noah, our depravity, our evilness, our consumerism is destroying vast areas of the earth. People say God swept away in a flood and destroyed. Why would he do that? They had already destroyed themselves. Their sinfulness, the ugliness of what they were doing, the depravity in which they were living had already destroyed themselves. And what God was doing was making a new start. You can always make a new start with Jesus. You can always make a new start with God. When Jonah was told to go and preach to Nineveh, he did everything possible to get out of doing it. He bought a ticket, all right, in the opposite direction. He went and he preached, and they listened, and they believed, and they were saved, and he was still annoyed, because he knew that God was gracious. But what was God saying in that? You can start all over again. What is Jesus saying when he stretched out his hands on the cross? I'm defeating death. I'm offering life. You can start all over again. And that's not just a one-off. You can always start all over again. Now I know if you've had a week like I've had mood swings. And you begin to think, oh, that's it, I've blown it now. How can I stand up here on a Sunday and speak when I know what I'm like? And God says, you can start all over again now. Right now. So if any of you are feeling that this morning, you've done things, you've said things to your family, you've said things to your friend, you've done things that you know that God doesn't approve of, and you're feeling guilty and condemned and far from God. If you don't hear anything else, hear this. Jesus is saying right now, you can start all over again, right now. And that's just how we have people here who are parents. When the little one falls over, you don't just say, well, that's it. You pick them up. You start all over again. And that's how God deals with us. So Noah is 7 days from the flood. And the animals are going in. And the food's going in. And then the rains begin. And the fountains of the deep are opened. And the storehouse of heaven is opened, and it rains. And God shuts the door. Nobody else could open that door until God decided it was time for it to be open. God shut the door. And sometimes in aspects of our lives we think, well, I'm sort of, I'm a prisoner to my past. No, God can cut that off, and He will shut the door to that sting that's in your past. You might still have memory of it, but the memory will be through the filter of knowing that God has shut the door to the effect and to the sting that it can have. So God shuts the door, and for 40 days the rains pour down. Now at this point most people think 40 days and then it begins to recede. No, for 40 days the waters continued to rise. And for 40 days, not a word from God. At the start, when they entered the ark and the door was shut up, Noah was following what God had said. But he didn't know how it was going to end. He didn't know whether he was going to be in this virtual coffin for the rest of his life. Apparently there was only one window in the ark, and that was at the top. If you read it fairly carefully, that's the impression you get, which is why he sends out a bird, because he can't see. He can't see whether the land is appearing. He can't see whether the waters are receding. All he can do is look upwards. And so after 40 days the rains stop. You can imagine, you know what it's like when there's 2 or 3 days of rain here. You know what it was like last July, when it seemed as though the rain was never going to stop. And the waters kept rising, and that was only for a couple of days. Can you imagine 40 days and not a word from God? Sometimes in our lives we become Christians, and I've experienced it, and I know that most other people here have experienced it. You become a Christian, then there are times when you think, since I've become a Christian, things have just got worse and worse and worse. And I should imagine that to Noah at that point, things looked as though they were getting worse and worse and worse. I've obeyed, I've done all this stuff, I've laboured with my hands, he shut up the door, the floods come, silence, nothing. And there are times in lives when that happens, but that's where faith comes in. Noah knew that God had said to him he would bring him through this, that he was in the ark providing a refuge in the storm. Was that refuge going to be forever? He didn't know. What he did know was that God would see him through. I think there's another scripture, isn't there, that talks about he who began a good work in you will see it through to the end. That's the truth. That's the absolute truth. It may not seem that way. Sometimes it doesn't. I've had a week when I thought, blimey neck, does it ever end? It's not ended yet, but I do know that God will see it through, that God is not away from us. He is close. He is closer than our breath. We just have to we sometimes have to force our minds and our hearts into saying, Lord, in my own strength I can do certain things, but there are things here that I can't control, but I want you to control. And sometimes that's all we can say. After 40 days, the waters began to recede. But the whole of the journey, by the look of it, took just about a year. And still, although Noah had sent out a bird, and the bird had come back with an olive branch, so he knew that there was now dry land, still, Noah didn't leave the ark. Why? Because God hadn't told him to yet. And there comes a point right at the end, the ark has been grounded, the waters have receded, the land is now flourishing. Then God says, as he said to Lazarus, come forth, come out of the ark, go forth and multiply. We've seen some terrible, terrible things this last couple of weeks, Burma and China. And it does test your faith. You begin to wonder why. But that's why it's so important that we shine as stars, that our faith is seen, because everything in this life can be swept away. But we are of those who know that there's more than just this life. There's more than just this shell. There's more than just this landscape. There's a whole new earth, a new heaven to come. There's a whole new body. We're told that we will be with him. I think it's John 14. It talks about, in my Father's house are many mansions. If it were not so, I would have told you. Jesus would have told us if it was something different, but it's not. It's exactly the same now as it was 2,000 years ago when he spoke that. And God will guide us through the journey, even though there are silences. Now sometimes we wonder why those silences are going on. And I don't know who it was who told me, it might have been someone here, about a friend of theirs who went on a journey. He got one of these new sat-navs, and they put in the coordinates, I want to go from A and I want to end up at B, and the sat-nav, I think all men seem to like the lovely lady's voice that speaks, and turn left now. And he said, yeah, it was working perfectly. I went all the way through Leeds, turn left, go forward, turn right there, left there, right, go up the hill, go back. And then he got onto the motorway, and he was going to London. And for 200 miles there was silence. And he began to wonder, is it not working? What, sort of tapping it and stuff, like you do. So it makes any difference if you tap it. And then he said, as he got towards the end, the voice came to life again. At the roundabout, go right. But for 200 miles there'd been complete silence. God hadn't forgotten. It just wasn't any necessity to say any more until it was time to say something more, until it was time to give the next direction. And I believe if I can learn a lesson, it's that sometimes the silence isn't God. not being there. It's just that at the moment, if I'm on the right path, if I'm going from A to B the way God has told me to, there's no need for God to sort of be chattering away all the time, if you like. It's hard because we need that guidance. We need that reassurance. But the reassurance is God knows. And I think in Genesis it does talk about and God remembered Noah and sent a wind, which is interesting, to begin to remove the effects of the storm, the flood waters. Could that wind have been the Holy Spirit? Could that wind in our lives be the Holy Spirit taking down the waters that the storm has brought upon us and bringing us safe to dry land? I believe it can be. So, come forth into the light of God. Be assured that if there's silence, God hasn't disappeared. Jesus is with you. Amen.